After 17 consecutive days with games for the Orioles, they finally made it to their final off day of the season on Monday, which means for me, I can open up the mailbag on today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Fans, today is Tuesday, September 26th, 2023, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are opening up the mailbag. I've got 8 Orioles questions, all from you, the listeners, to answer on today's mailbag. We'll hit on topics like, what should the O's do pitching-wise if they do clinch the division in the middle of this week? What do you think about Félix Bautista potentially being on the playoff roster? Another look at the potential playoff rotation, some comparisons between this team and the 1983 Orioles, and much more. And that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. But first, just want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating and a review if you can, wherever you listen to the podcast. And also make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, quickly approaching 5,000 subscribers now. Once we get to 5,000, we will do another Orioles-themed giveaway. All you have to do is be subscribed on YouTube to be entered to win that giveaway. So make sure you go and subscribe. It's been an incredible season. The Orioles' magic number is 3 to win the AL East here in the final week of the regular season. Who would have thought? And just wanted to thank you all for being along for the ride. The everydayers out there, those who pop in and out, those who may have just found the podcast. Hope you're enjoying the regular season content. It's even going to ramp up more as we know the Orioles are into the postseason. So make sure you stick around. But on today's podcast, this hasn't happened in a while. The Orioles had an off day on Monday. Finally, they got to the off day. It was 17 consecutive days for the Orioles playing a game in late September. Brutal scheduling for Major League Baseball. And yet the Orioles finally get to their final off day here on Monday before 6 consecutive games, 2 at home against the Nats and 4 at home against the Red Sox to finish off the season. Again, the magic number is 3 for the Orioles. That means 3 combined Orioles wins and Rays losses. Rays, who are also off Monday, have 2 in Boston. Then they're off again Thursday, and then 3 in Toronto against the Blue Jays to finish off the season. Looking very likely that the O's are going to clinch the division this week. And of course, I'll have all the coverage right here on the podcast. But got a lot of great questions from you all for the mailbag today. If your question that you sent in is not answered on today's episode, don't worry. It's in the backlog. I will get to it on a future mailbag, potentially, depending on kind of what the question was about. Could be answered in an off-season mailbag, but continue to send in those questions. Got so many great ones. Had to choose the 8 best that I got for today's episode. And let's start with our first question of the day. And honestly, I got essentially this same question from 2 different people, and it was definitely my favorite question that I got of the day, having to do with what the O's kind of do next. So the question came from Jeremy and Vance. Both of them sent in a version of this question via email, and it basically goes like this. If the Orioles clinch earlier in the week, like somewhere around Wednesday or Thursday, the earliest they can clinch is Wednesday. My prediction is they probably clinch Thursday with a win over the Red Sox. That's my prediction. So the question is, if they do that, will they start to sit some starters? Will the rotation, will the lineup look different for those final, 3 or 4 games of the regular season once they've locked everything up? And it is a good question because in maybe previous years, the last time the Orioles were in a position to win a division, you got to go back to 2014. The Orioles clinched, if you remember, in 2014, the last time they won the AL East, they clinched in mid-September. There was basically 2 weeks left of the regular season after the Orioles clinched. Now, they were still somewhat playing for some things like best record in the American League, but generally they had all locked up what they needed to lock up with 2 weeks remaining. And back then was when you had the crazy expanded September rosters. You could bring up to 40 players to carry with you for an active game in a September game. So there were the hangover lineups, like you call them, which is the day after you clinch, you just play all the rookies. You had a crazy amount of pitchers, different guys starting games, coming in relief. Now, the Orioles were still keeping their guys fresh because they had the playoffs to worry about, but they were definitely rotating some guys in. It's not going to be the same thing this year. Let's say the Orioles clinch. I mean, Wednesday is a good thing. Let's give them a little time. Let's say they clinch Thursday night against the Red Sox. That gives them Friday, Saturday, Sunday, where they're not really playing for much. Now, they still could be in play to try and get the best record in baseball, right? Which would give you home field advantage in the World Series. You're trying to have a better record than the Dodgers and the Braves potentially for a World Series matchup, but that's so far in the future. Once you lock up the division, you've also locked up the number 1 seed in the American League. You have home field advantage throughout the AL side of the playoffs. You pretty much have it all clinched. And although you'll get that week of rest next week because you'd avoid the wild card series, you might want a little rest over the weekend. However, you can't do what you used to do because although rosters do expand from 26 to 28 in September, they don't expand all the way to 40. And you don't have a lot of wiggle room because, as I understand the roster rules, the time that players have to spend in the minor league. So if you are a position player and you're optioned down to AAA, you have to stay down there for at least 10 days unless there's an injury before you can come back up. For a pitcher, you have to stay down there for at least 15 days before you can come back up. And those rules apply to the postseason as well. So say the Orioles clinch Thursday night against Boston, even if they tried to, let's say, option a couple of pitchers down to AAA and call up a couple of guys just to eat some meaningless innings over the weekend, those pitchers that they would option would then not be available for any of the ALDS. So you're not going to do that. And even with the hitters, the ALDS would start less than 10 days after that Thursday clinch. So you're not going to do that one either. So there's not a great way to kind of rest a lot of your guys and get them off their feet if you were to clinch, say, on Thursday in those final 3 games. So here's the changes I think the Orioles will make if they do clinch, kind of in the middle of the week with some games remaining. First of all, you're going to see a lot more James McCann over the weekend. Once the Orioles clinch, I would pretty much guarantee you that the very next day, Adley Rutschman will get a full day off, and he will probably get 2 full days off, not even DHing, once the O's clinch. They'll probably have James McCann catch back-to-back days, and then you'll probably throw Adley in there one more time, not to wear down McCann and have him catch it a bunch of days in a row when he hasn't really done it this year. Also, you're going to see probably Heston Kjerstad in the lineup every single day, who hasn't been in there as much. Probably Jordan Westberg in the lineup every single day, the younger guy who, hasn't been in there every day. You're almost certainly going to see Ryan McKenna and Jorge Mateo in the lineup every single day because they're pretty much bench players at this point, pinch runners, defensive replacements. Mateo's still starting a little bit, but those 2 guys are going to be in the starting lineup. If they clinch Thursday, I would bet that Mateo and McKenna are starting and playing every inning Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because they are very well rested. You'd like to get them some more at-bats. That would be the big change made offensively. But you can't really rest guys. You can give, I would say you could find a way throughout those 3 days to give each of your main guys, Rutschman, Henderson, Santander, even O'Hearn, Hayes, Hicks, all of them would at least get 1 full day off during that weekend. But with only 28 players to work with, you can't really option guys. You really don't have a lot of options on the roster to rest guys for long periods of time. Now, in terms of the pitchers, that's the other issue here, right? Like, you kind of have to use the same bullpen guys. Now, you could maybe use Jorge Lopez a little bit more because, as we know, Lopez is not eligible for the postseason roster. So once Sunday hits, his season is over. So maybe you use Lopez on back-to-back or even 3 straight days if you need him because his year is done after Sunday. But something else I could see the Orioles doing is anybody who, when they get to maybe Friday, that they feel on the pitching staff is not going to be on the playoff roster, that player will probably be optioned to AAA to get somebody else up there. And the one that I think will be really interesting will be Jorge Lopez. Because yes, you could use him 3 straight days, right? And just, get him there, use him up, and then he's done for. What you could also do is maybe DFA Jorge Lopez on either Saturday or Sunday, replace him with Cole Irvin. Irvin will be eligible to come back up from AAA on Thursday. His 15 days down in the minors will be up on Thursday. So if you clinch Thursday, maybe you wait till Sunday morning. you DFA Jorge Lopez, and you call up Cole Irvin, and Irvin then becomes a guy who starts Sunday's games. You don't have to use another starter. You can use Irvin, who's rested, and then he'll still be ready to go for next Saturday when the ALDS starts, if you do want to put Irvin on the playoff roster. The other thing I think they could do is maybe give Jack Flaherty a start, because we know he's been moved to the bullpen. But as long as you didn't need to use him in the pen too much this week, I would consider giving Flaherty one more start in a game that's meaningless once you've clinched the division, just to see if he still could potentially start for you in the postseason if you needed it. Now, you're still going to need to start the regular guys. So, let's say as the rotation maps out here, it's going to be Bradish tonight. It's going to be Grayson tomorrow night. You're going to see Kramer on Thursday. Maybe when you clinch with Kramer on Thursday, there is a possibility that as you look further down the line from Dean Kramer and you get to John Means, maybe you shorten John Means' start on Friday. Maybe you say you're only going 5 innings no matter what. Maybe you shorten Kyle Gibson's start on Saturday. You're only going 5 innings no matter what. And then you call up Cole Irvin to make the start Sunday. And I think that's a way the Orioles could limit the innings guys are pitching, limit the position players on their feet, while still knowing that the roster restrictions are there. And you really still have to play your guys down the stretch. You can't just call up, 10 guys from the minors, put together an amazing hangover lineup like you used to do back when you could have 40 guys on the roster in September. And honestly, I like it better this way. Buck Showalter always used to say this: September baseball was like different than anything else because you got 40 guys up there. It's ridiculous. This is a much better way to do it. Second question comes from Evan on Twitter, who asks, how would you fit a limited Félix Bautista onto the postseason roster? It's an interesting question here with Félix Bautista. He threw a live bullpen over the weekend. He continues to throw, and we still don't know exactly what's going to happen with Bautista. Been out since late August with the UCL injury against the Rockies, hasn't pitched in the game since then, but he's still potentially eligible to come back, and the Orioles have not closed the door on that. Now, a normal line of thinking would say, if we're going to see Félix in the playoffs, you'd have to think we'll see Félix activated at some point this week to at least throw 1 inning in a regular season game. Now, I would guess maybe they would wait until after they clinch to do that. So maybe Bautista would be a move you'd see Saturday or Sunday, just to throw an inning at any random point and see how he throws in a regular season game. But I couldn't imagine the O's would not have him pitch at all in the regular season and still put him on the playoff roster and say, if we use you, it's just you're coming back in the playoffs and we really don't know what we have. Now, they're going to somewhat know because they've seen him throw bullpens and live BPs, but in a game is different. So you would think they'd probably use him at least once in the regular season. If they do, and they're still kind of on the fence, my initial guess would say that on the Orioles postseason roster, they probably carry 12 pitchers and 14 hitters, just because they have a lot of good hitting options, and you need less pitchers in the postseason with all the off days. So you can get away with carrying 12 when they usually carry 13, and you carry 14 in September. You can get away with 12 pitchers because you only need 4 starters. You have some long guys in the pen. Most teams use 12 pitchers in the playoffs. I could see the Orioles saying, you know what? For the ALDS, we're actually going to roster 13 pitchers and 13 hitters, and that 13th pitcher is going to be Félix Bautista. Now, there's no guarantee that we would use him, but we're going to use that spot on Bautista, and if we get him in there, we get him in there. And if he does throw and he gets hurt, which would be very unfortunate, you are allowed to replace players on the playoff roster if they get injured. But if you do replace a player on the playoff roster because of injury, that injured player is not only ineligible for the rest of that series, they're also ineligible for the rest of the next series. So basically, if the O's do throw Félix in the ALDS, he gets hurt again, you can't bring him back after that, essentially. But that's one way I could see them doing it, saying, let's carry an extra pitcher, have it be Félix. We'll still have the 12 arms to use. And if we still think there's a chance, if you think there's a chance you can use him, throw him on the ALDS roster, right? Like, he could still be a weapon if you think he can still be effective. Third question of the day comes from a couple of different people. Tommy and Andy both asked similar versions of this on Twitter, asking if it came down to Jacob Webb versus Shintaro Fujinami for the final bullpen spot on the Orioles playoff roster, who you taking? Now, I personally think that if I were putting together a roster right now, I think I would put both Webb and Fuji on the playoff roster right now. Now, they'd have two of the last spots in the bullpen, but I honestly think maybe they'd have the final two spots right now. And I still have to work out what I think this playoff roster is going to be. We'll get to that next week on the podcast. But if I had to choose one, I think I'd choose Jacob Webb. Although he's been struggling a little bit lately, he has been more consistent, obviously, than Fuji has. You much more know what you're going to get out of Webb. He also can pitch pretty much every day, it feels like. Like Webb easily could take the ball 3 days in a row if you needed him to. And in the playoffs with the off days, you never play more than 3 games in a row without an off day. So that helps you. And also, Jacob Webb has the postseason experience. Like he pitched in the postseason with the 2021 Braves team that won the World Series. He's pitched in multiple postseasons with Atlanta before he was with the Angels and then with the Orioles. I would just trust him more in that spot. But I think if you don't have Félix Bautista, Fuji has the best strikeout stuff on the team, and you need relievers that can strike guys out. The Orioles bullpen right now is really struggling to strike out batters. You need guys who can get strikeouts. And although Fuji might be wild and you never know what you're going to get out of him, I'd still put him on the playoff roster too. And if you need a couple of strikeouts, you take the chance and go to him because he's got the stuff that can whiff guys at any time. It is high risk, but he's also high reward. And without Félix Bautista, I'm still putting Fuji on that playoff roster. But we got 5 more questions to get to here on a mailbag episode. Coming up next, we will talk a bit about the Orioles' potential opponents in the postseason. We'll talk about what the rotation could look like, but depending on those opponents. And then a nice question about who should throw out the first pitch this year at the Orioles' first postseason game. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by LinkedIn Sales. Are you struggling to close out deals? Cold outreach is wasting the time of both the buyer and the seller at every single stage, especially when sellers are using shallow and outdated data. Your organization can overcome these challenges with technology that translates comprehensive, high-quality buyer data into real-time insights. These deeper insights empower sales reps and teams to adopt the habits of top performers, which leads to better outcomes like more pipeline, higher win rates, and larger deals. We call this deep sales. We built the first deep sales platform with the next generation of LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And right now, you can try LinkedIn Sales Navigator and get a 60-day free trial at linkedin.com/lockedon. That is linkedin.com/lockedon for a 60-day free trial. Let LinkedIn Sales Navigator help you sell like a superstar today. Just go to linkedin.com/lockedon and get started. So we're back here on a mailbag episode of the podcast. 5 more Orioles questions to get to, all from you, the listeners. Thank you so much for sending in your questions. The next one comes from a couple different people. Wesley and Mark on Twitter both asked a similar version of this question, which is, besides the Astros, is there a team you really don't want to see the Orioles face in the ALDS? And actually on the last mailbag episode of the pod, I kind of talked about who I want to face the least in the playoffs. And it was the Astros back then because they scare me. Even though the O's just went in and took a series from Houston on the road and were very close to sweeping that series, and the fact that the Astros have fallen completely apart, just lost series to the A's once and the Royals twice. They were just swept at home by the Royals the other day. That's not good. They still have all the experience. They still have a dangerous lineup. They still have a good staff. They scare me the most out of anyone in the American League. So I basically wanted to rank from the team I least want to play to the team I most want to play among the American League playoff contenders that the Orioles could see in the ALDS. Now, there's 5 of these teams because there's basically 7 teams for 6 spots right now. Of course, the Orioles can't play themselves, and there's no way the Orioles can play the Minnesota Twins in the ALDS because the Twins have locked up the AL Central. They're going to be the 3 seed, and they are going to be hosting essentially the wild card series, with the winner of that series going to play the 2 seed. There is no way the Orioles can be the 2 seed in the American League. So because of that, they cannot play the Twins, but they could play everyone else. Even with the Astros struggles, they still scare me the most. They've just done it before. That lineup is crazy. I do not want to see the combination of Yordan Alvarez or Kyle Tucker anymore this season. I'm done with it. Don't want to play them at all. Number 2 scariest is the Texas Rangers for me. They were hitting a skid for a while there in early September, but they have turned it on lately, just swept the Mariners over the weekend to jump back into first place in that crazy American League West. O's have played some interesting series with them this year. All in all, the O's are 3-3 against Texas. Most of those games were much earlier in the season. One series on the road in April and then at home in June. But even though that pitching staff is very suspect, they don't have a good bullpen. There's questions about their starting rotation with all the injuries. DeGrom and Scherzer are both out. They've got a crazy good offense. And if the Orioles, a team with a better offense than a pitching staff, gets into a battle with another team with a really good offense, there's always that chance that the Rangers just out-hit the Orioles, bludgeon their pitching, and win that series. And the Rangers have played some really good baseball against the O's this year. That lineup 1-9 is scary. I don't really want to see that team either. Third scariest for me is the Rays. I put them in the middle because they're so freaking injured at this point, and they just lost Brandon Lau. Arozarena just got hurt. Yandy Diaz just went down with a slight injury. I mean, they just keep getting injured. Jason Adam is back on the injured list. But even with all the injuries, every player they bring up from AAA seems to be almost as good as the player they replaced. Like, they don't miss a beat with all those injuries. Yes, the O's went 8-5 against the Rays this year, but it's still going to be a battle. As we know, every time they play, the Rays have been there, done that in the postseason. I also think the O's are a better team right now, so that's why they're right in the middle. Seattle is fourth for me. Yes, that Seattle pitching staff scares me, right? They have a great young staff, but they have been showing some cracks lately. They are currently the team, as I record Monday evening, sitting in the 7th spot, a half game back on the outside looking in to the AL playoff picture. Julio Rodriguez is great, but otherwise that offense just does not scare me. And we saw that, in that series in Seattle when the O's won the game 1-0 in 10 innings. I mean, George Kirby pitched 9 shutout innings against the O's, and the Mariners still lost the game somehow. The Orioles 4-2 against Seattle this year. The team just doesn't scare me a lot. I think they have a lot of holes, especially offensively. And then number 5 is Toronto. Listen, to me, bring on the Blue Jays. Orioles 10-3 against Toronto this year. Just absolutely dominated that team. Yes, the offense looks good on paper. Yes, the rotation looks good on paper. And even the bullpen is probably a little better than it looks on paper. But when that team gets to play in the Orioles, or really any good team, I mean, that's been the Blue Jays thing this year. They've beaten up on the bad teams. And when they've played the good teams, except for over the weekend against the Rays, thank you, Blue Jays, they've been really bad against the AL East. They've been really bad against playoff teams. I think the Orioles just have their number. I would invite an Orioles-Blue Jays ALDS. Next question came from a bunch of people, had a similar version of this question, mostly asking about the pitching rotation for the playoffs, which is going to be a point of talking as we continue towards the postseason. John, Alexander, JP, Scott, Joshua, Manny, and Milo all asking a version of this question on Twitter. Is the projected starting rotation going to be different potentially based on the matchups in the ALDS? So this assumes that the Orioles can, with the magic number 3, win the AL East this week and advance directly to the American League Division Series, which would start at Camden Yards next Saturday, October 7th. And honestly, I think yes. I think it could change. Now, here's how the ALDS works. Game 1 and 2 would be at Camden Yards. 3 and 4 would be on the road. And then game 5, if necessary, would be back at home. So if they're, say, playing the Houston Astros, right, a team with a really good offense in a really, really tiny ballpark, as we saw last week, I'd have Bradish start game 1. Then John Means, a fly ball pitcher, even though he pitched well in Houston last week, I'd put Means game 2 to make sure he started at Camden Yards with the big wall in left. He's a pitcher who gives up a good amount of homers and pitches to contact. A fly ball pitcher, I want him pitching at home. I don't want him pitching in Houston. Then in game 3, I'd go Grayson Rodriguez. He's more so a ground ball pitcher, and I can see him dominating the Astros. If it got to game 4, I'd go Kyle Gibson because he is the Orioles' biggest ground ball pitcher, and I think he can keep the ball in the yard in Houston. And then I'd go back to Kyle Bradish in game 5 if it went there. I do a similar thing for the Rays. They don't have as small a ballpark as Houston, but still a smaller park. That's kind of the same thing I would do with the Rays. If it's Seattle, I'd go a little differently. Seattle's park does play smaller than Baltimore's, but it's not as crazy as Houston. Against Seattle, I'd go Bradish and Grayson 1 and 2 to try and get the lead in the series. Then I'd go Means game 3 in Seattle because, listen, if there's anybody who likes pitching in Seattle, it's John Means, where he threw his no-hitter. Game 4, I'd then go Dean Kramer because it just feels like I would rather have him out there. And really, Dean Kramer in game 4 is because I don't want Kyle Gibson pitching against the Mariners. He's pitched against Seattle twice this year, and the Mariners completely blew up Kyle Gibson in his 2 starts against them this year. So if it is the Mariners, I'd actually take Gibson out, put him in the bullpen, put Kramer in there for game 4, and then back to Bradish in game 5. And then finally, if it's anyone else, so say if it is Toronto or it's Texas, I would probably go Bradish game 1, and then I might still have Means go game 2 just because he's the fly ball pitcher, get some help from the big wall and left. Then Grayson game 3, Gibson game 4, and Kyle Bradish again in game 5. That's how I change things depending on the matchups and the ballparks as well. Sixth question of the day comes from Ethan on Twitter, who asks, who should throw out the first pitch at Oriole Park in game 1 of the ALDS next Saturday? So assuming the Orioles do get there, I think for game 1 of the playoffs, and most likely if they do get there, it would be their first playoff game in 2023. It would be their first home playoff game in 9 years since 2014. You kind of just have to completely play to the crowd in your first playoff game back. And it feels like it's kind of got to be like an Orioles legend, right? So my mind immediately goes to Adam Jones. That would be like the easy answer. I think guys like Jim Palmer, Eddie Murray, Cal Ripken would be other good answers as well. But I feel like Adam Jones, he was on that 2014 team the last time a home playoff game happened. He's obviously mended his relationship with the Orioles. They retired him as an Oriole a couple of weeks ago. I just think Adam Jones has got to be the easy answer, and he would get that crowd fired up before first pitch of game 1. But I like that question. I'm going to talk a little bit more in the coming podcasts about like who the other first pitch throwers could be if the O's really do make a long playoff run. But got 2 more questions to get to on a mailbag episode. One is about the Orioles lineups they've used this year and how they have differed throughout the season. And the other is about comparing the 2023 Orioles to their last World Series team 40 years ago in 1983. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Jase Medical. Now, what is Jase Medical? Well, they've got an interesting product here, and it's pretty simple. You go online, you fill out a form, and then you get prescription, life-saving medications delivered right to your door. The Jase case, their main product, gives you peace of mind so that you're not just hoping that you'll have access to medication in an emergency. Jase Medical makes sure you have that medication in hand. And Jase Medical thinks everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. And that's why they offer the Jase case. And you can get $20 off on these life-saving antibiotics today from Jase Medical by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. So 2 more questions to get to here on a mailbag episode of the podcast. Thank you all so much for sending in your questions. But before we get to those 2 questions, got to talk a little bit about Orioles baseball because, yes, that off day was nice, right? The O's absolutely needed it, but it's just the one off day. And it was their final off day of the season. They are right back to playing baseball tonight. And it starts this incredible 6-game homestand to finish off the season. The magic number is at 3. The Rays, who were also off on Monday, they are back in action. They are in Boston against the Red Sox at 7:10 tonight. Zach Eflin with a 3.44 ERA goes for the Rays, and Tanner Houck, the sidewinding right-hander with a 4.92 ERA, goes for Boston in Fenway at that game. We know how crazy it can get at Fenway. Hopefully the Red Sox bats can heat up. And for the Orioles, it'll be Kyle Bradish going in tonight's game 1 against the Washington Nationals. The O's, who swept the Nats in the 2-game series all the way back at the beginning of the season in D.C. Now they're back at it. The Nats, yeah, they've been kind of scrappy this year, but they're also 69-88. They're not a very good baseball team. And Kyle Bradish will take the hill for the Orioles with a 3.01 ERA in what could be his final start of the regular season if things go well for the O's. His last time out was 6 scoreless, 2 hits, 9 Ks, and 2 walks, was just dominant in Houston against the Astros in that one. And Bradish did start in D.C. at Nats Park all the way back on April 19th. He was awesome in that one too. 6 scoreless, 5 hits, 6 Ks, and just 1 walk in that one. As I record here on Monday evening, the Nationals starters are TBA for both of these games. You kind of don't know what a team's going to do when they're completely out of it in the last week. They might, mix pitchers together, throw piggyback guys, throw one young starter for 3 innings, another one for 3 more innings. You just kind of don't know, but the O's got to be ready for everything in tonight's game 1. And you can listen to every single pitch of tonight's game 1 between the O's and the Nats, where they can't quite clinch yet, but they can get very close with a win. You can listen to every pitch on the SXM app through SiriusXM. Just download the app and search Orioles. But before we get to that game, 2 more mailbag questions to get to here on a mailbag episode. And the first one comes from Justin on YouTube with a really interesting question asking, are there any lineups the Orioles this season have used more than others? And Justin went on to talk about how it feels like the O's kind of mix and match all the time in their lineup. Brandon Hyde always talks about how he likes to use all 13 or in September, all 14 hitters that he has at his disposal, doesn't want guys sitting on the bench for too long. And he really backs that up, except for maybe like Ryan McKenna right now, because he's only here to be a defensive replacement or a pinch runner. Everybody else is pretty much getting themselves in the lineup at least every third day. And it was interesting. I took a look on Baseball Reference to see like what the most usual lineups the Orioles are using. And in terms of just defensive defensive assignments, so this isn't just lineup order. This is just where guys are playing around the field and at DH. The high for number of times they have repeated just a defensive alignment is 4 times in a starting lineup. That's how much the Orioles move things around. And if you want to go with the actual whole starting lineup, so not just defensive alignment, but also hitters 1 through 9 in the lineup, the most common lineup has been used 3 times. That's how much the Orioles mix and match, and that's how deep this team is, that their most used lineup has been used 3 times. It was used 3 times in June. So it was just kind of a lineup that was go-to for Brandon Hyde in a 2-week stretch in June. It was used June 13th against the Blue Jays, June 20th in Tampa, and June 23rd against the Mariners. The Orioles won 2 of those 3 games. This was the lineup that's been used 3 times, which has the lead for the O's. Gunnar DHing, hitting leadoff, Adley catching, hitting second, Santander in right field, hitting third, Ryan O'Hearn at first base, hitting fourth, Austin Hayes in left, hitting fifth, Aaron Hicks in center, surprisingly, hitting sixth. That tells you how much Mullins has been injured this year. Adam Frazier at second base, hitting seventh, Ramon Arias at third base, hitting eighth, and Jorge Mateo hitting ninth and playing shortstop. That lineup exactly 1 through 9, just like that, with the same positions, has been used 3 times. That is the most used lineup by the Orioles. And even that lineup, the 3 times they used it, it was a different starting pitcher in all 3 of those games in June when they used it. That's what tells you the Orioles essentially, it's very rare that they have the same lineup twice with all the positions, all the hitters in order, and the starting pitcher. But sometimes, sign of a good team, right? You got a lot of good players. You can get in there 1 through 9. They're hard to get out. You can mix and match. I think it makes them dangerous in October. And the final question to get to comes from Brandon on YouTube. Another good question. Actually, Brandon, this question, he asked, what players from these 2023 Orioles would you match up with the players who contributed to the 1983 Orioles winning their last World Series, of course, 40 years ago? And Brandon, this is such a good question that I actually think I want to get to it maybe sometime next week when the Orioles hopefully have the week off, not playing in the wild card series, waiting for the ALDS. I want to break it down even further, like player by player. But let me get you a couple of names just to kind of get the appetite going for this question, which was a great question. I mean, the easiest comparison between these 2 teams is you've got a 22-year-old Rookie of the Year shortstop. Cal Ripken Jr., who won the Rookie of the Year the previous year in 1982, had an 888 OPS as a 22-year-old shortstop on the World Series team. Gunnar Henderson, after the terrible start, an 821 OPS as a 22-year-old shortstop on this team and is going to win AL Rookie of the Year this year. Pretty similar, pretty cool right there. Of course, you got one of the greatest players in history in Cal Ripken. I was hoping the same happens for Gunnar Henderson. But maybe a little deeper cut here before we finish up on today's mailbag episode. Everybody wants to compare Ryan O'Hearn to someone, right? And he gets a lot of comparisons to Steve Pearce, and I totally see it, right? I am on board with that one. But if we want to go a little further back than Steve Pearce and go back to the last Orioles 1983 World Series team, Ryan O'Hearn, who has come out of nowhere to have an 830 OPS and be a huge producer in the middle of the Orioles lineup after he was DFA'd and traded for nothing from the Royals, the worst team in baseball. How about Jim Dwyer? Ryan O'Hearn is kind of the Jim Dwyer on the field of this Orioles team. Jim Dwyer, who had a little bit of a better season actually than Ryan O'Hearn. Dwyer had an 887 OPS for the 1983 Orioles, but it was kind of a similar situation where he had come over to Baltimore a couple years prior, but he was really, somewhat of a journeyman before that, had played on multiple different teams. He was a little older than O'Hearn, but in general, he had never played as much as Dwyer did in 1983. For both O'Hearn this year and Dwyer 40 years ago, the season was their first in which they had played at least 100 games in one season for one team. Both of these guys had moved around a bit, been a part-time player until that season. And Dwyer, in the playoffs, was really good for the Orioles. And of course, it was just the ALCS and the World Series back then. But Dwyer, who didn't play every day in those playoffs, but when he did, he made the most of it. Went 4 for 12 with a double and hit a home run in that 1983 World Series against the Phillies. Maybe that's what Ryan O'Hearn can do in 2023. But plenty of great questions for today's mailbag. Continue to get in those questions. LockedOnOrioles@gmail.com is the email address, at LockedOnOrioles on Twitter. You can also leave questions right here in the YouTube comments as well, and I'll answer them on a future mailbag. Depending on the schedule, probably going to do another mailbag before the playoffs start, but we'll also have plenty of them in the offseason as well to get to more topics I know you've asked about pertaining to 2024 and beyond for the Orioles. But I'll be back tomorrow. Once again, have a baseball game to talk about, breaking down game 1 between the Orioles and the Nationals in the Beltway battle, hoping the O's are this much closer to clinching the AL East. That's coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.